Willow Creek was the kind of town where nothing happened. Tucked away in the rolling hills of upstate New York, it was a quiet, almost forgotten place. The streets were lined with aging Victorian houses, and the town's heartbeat was the lone general store, run by Miss Barrett, a lifelong resident who knew everyone's secrets, or so she thought. The creek that gave the town its name whispered through the thick woods, carrying with it the stories of generations. But for the first time in over 50 years, Willow Creek had a secret that no one could talk about. The brutal murder of Mary Holden had shattered the town's peaceful veneer. Mary, a local schoolteacher known for her quiet demeanor and an assuming lifestyle, was found in her own home, lifeless. Her body, discovered by a neighbor who had grown suspicious after not seeing her for days, lay in a pool of blood in the living room. The walls were splattered with violent streaks, and the floor was littered with signs of a struggle. Whoever had killed her had done so with rage. Her death was the first in decades, and it rattled the town to its core. Rumors spread like wildfire. The small police force, led by Sheriff Tom Willis, was overwhelmed. They weren't used to handling more than the occasional shoplifting case or a domestic dispute. This was something different, something darker. And it was clear that the town would never be the same again. So the investigation began slowly, like the wheels of an old clock turning for the first time in years. Sheriff Willis, a man nearing retirement, found himself staring down a crime he wasn't equipped to solve. Mary Holden's home was meticulously examined for evidence, but the scene was a nightmare. The brutality of the murder was enough to send a chill down his spine. The medical examiner, brought in from a nearby county, confirmed what the sheriff had feared. Mary had been beaten to death with a blunt object, possibly a hammer, though the murder weapon was never found. Her hands and wrists were bruised from attempting to fight off her attacker. But in the end, she had been overpowered. The killer had taken their time, as if savoring the violence. The doors were locked from the inside, and no windows were broken. Whoever did this had known Mary, or, at the very least, had gained her trust. The sheriff had questioned the neighbor who discovered the body, but she hadn't seen anyone unusual. She had assumed Mary had gone on one of her weekend trips to visit family. But after a few days without a word, she knew something was wrong. The town had always been close-knit, but Mary's death drove a wedge of suspicion between the residents. The people avoided eye contact on the streets, and whispered conversations in the diner hinted at darker possibilities. The idea that someone from Willow Creek could have committed such a heinous crime was unthinkable, yet the lack of any sign of forced entry pointed in that direction. The deeper the sheriff dug, the more questions arose. Mary's past was uneventful, her relationships minimal. She had no known enemies, no bitter ex-boyfriends or jealous colleagues. The perfect victim in some ways for a killer who wanted to stay hidden. But the sheriff knew better than to think anyone's life was truly without complication. There had to be something. A hidden grudge, a secret life. Something had driven this person to kill. Days passed, and the investigation grew colder despite the town's growing unease. The sheriff spent hours combing through Mary's personal life, searching for the slightest thread that could unravel the mystery. Her house, though modest, was kept in near perfect order. No personal diaries, no cryptic messages, nothing out of place to suggest a secret life. It was maddening. However, one unsettling detail emerged that gave Sheriff Willis pause. While reviewing Mary's finances, it became clear she had been withdrawing small, yet consistent, sums of cash every month. In a town like Willow Creek, where people rarely dealt in anything but checks or credit cards, cash was an oddity. More disturbing was the fact that no one seemed to know what she was doing with the money. At first, it didn't seem like much. $50 here, $100 there. But after months of withdrawals, the total had accumulated into thousands. There were no unusual purchases on her credit card, no expensive items in her home that would suggest she had been spending lavishly. The cash had simply disappeared. Sheriff Willis felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, but none of them quite fit. The withdrawals could mean blackmail, but blackmailers rarely resorted to murder, at least not without first bleeding their victim dry. Could Mary have been involved in something illegal, perhaps even under duress? Or was she paying off a debt no one knew about? The possibilities were endless, but answers were scarce. The sheriff interviewed Mary's colleagues at the elementary school, but they described her as quiet, kind, and professional. Her life, from their perspective, had been as simple as it appeared on the surface. She had lived alone, occasionally met friends for dinner, and spent most of her free time reading or going for long walks near the creek. Despite the town's reputation for serenity, a darkness seemed to hover over Willow Creek, growing thicker with each passing day. When the sheriff began to feel like he was missing something critical, something right in front of him that he couldn't yet see. As the investigation reached its second week, whispers about an outsider began to circulate. A few townsfolk had reported seeing a man near Mary's house days before her murder, a face no one recognized. Descriptions varied. Some said he was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard, while others recalled a clean-shaven man in his 30s. What they all agreed on was that he was a stranger, and in a town like Willow Creek, a stranger stood out. Sheriff Willis, now desperate for a lead, dug into the reports. It was uncommon for anyone new to pass through the town unnoticed, especially someone who lingered near Mary's house. Whoever this man was, he had vanished as quickly as he appeared. Then, something else came to light, a truck. It wasn't local, and it had been spotted parked at the edge of the woods bordering the creek late one night. The truck had been covered in dirt and grime, as though it had traveled a long distance, and its driver had been seen walking toward the tree line. The sheriff sent a team to scour the woods near the creek, hoping to find something, tire tracks, discarded items, anything. But the search turned up nothing of value. The woods were thick and sprawling, providing plenty of places for someone to hide, if they knew where to go. It was a dead end, but the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger and the truck were connected to Mary's murder. The townspeople were growing more restless by the day. Fear began to seep into everyday life. Parents kept their children close, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and the sense of community that had once been the heart of Willow Creek began to fray. The realization that a killer could still be lurking among them was impossible to ignore. For Sheriff Willis, the pressure was mounting. He knew the town was counting on him to solve this, but he couldn't shake the nagging fear that Willow Creek was hiding something deeper, something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And if he didn't uncover the truth soon, the killer might strike again. So with every passing day, Willow Creek's quaint charm unraveled further, revealing cracks in its peaceful facade. As Sheriff Willis continued to dig into Mary's life, he uncovered something that sent a chill down his spine. An old police report, nearly 15 years old, about a domestic disturbance involving Mary and her then-boyfriend, a man named Carl Weller. Carl had been a drifter, someone who passed through town working odd jobs and briefly dated Mary. According to the report, the relationship had ended when Mary filed a restraining order after Carl became violent. The sheriff's predecessor had handled the case, and Carl had left town soon after, never to be seen again, or so everyone had believed. Sheriff Willis wondered if Carl had resurfaced. Had he returned to settle an old score, or had he been watching her from a distance all these years? The timeline fit. The sudden appearance of the stranger in town could have been Carl, back after all this time, looking for revenge. Yet something didn't add up. The brutality of the murder suggested something more recent, more immediate. While Carl had a history of violence, this felt personal in a different way, almost intimate. So the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing a key piece of the puzzle, something that would connect all the disparate threads into a coherent picture. He tracked down the last known address of Carl Weller, a rundown trailer park in a neighboring county. The sheriff paid a visit, but the manager hadn't seen Carl in months. His trailer sat abandoned, and the inside was in disarray, as if Carl had left in a hurry. No forwarding address, no sign of where he might have gone. Another dead end. Frustration gnawed at Sheriff Willis as he returned to Willow Creek. The mystery of Mary's murder felt like a tangled web, and the more he pulled at the threads, the more they slipped from his grasp. There was a darkness in this town, and it ran deeper than just Mary's death. Something was festering beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more obsessed Sheriff Willis became with the creek that ran behind Mary's house. There was something about it, its quiet, winding path, the way it disappeared into the dense woods, that felt significant. It had always been a place of calm, where families picnicked in the summer and children played near its banks. But now the creek seemed to hold a sinister presence, as though it had witnessed something unspeakable. One cold October morning, Sheriff Willis decided to walk the length of the creek himself, tracing the path from Mary's house deep into the woods. As he walked, the wind rustled through the trees, and the sound of water rushing over rocks became hypnotic. He had always believed that killers left something behind, whether intentionally or not, and he hoped this walk might reveal a hidden clue. Halfway through his trek, he found it. Near a bend in the creek, the sheriff spotted something partially buried in the mud. Bending down, he brushed away the leaves and dirt to reveal an old, rusted hammer. His heart raced. Could this be the murder weapon? It had been out in the elements for days, maybe longer, but there was no doubt it was capable of delivering the kind of fatal blows that had killed Mary. The sheriff bagged the hammer, careful not to disturb it further, and returned to town with renewed determination. But as he drove back, something nagged at him. Why would the killer leave the weapon here so close to the crime scene? It was almost too convenient, as if it had been placed there for someone to find. The sheriff sent the hammer for testing, hoping for fingerprints or any trace evidence that could lead him to Mary's killer. But deep down, he feared it wouldn't be that simple. In small towns like Willow Creek, the truth was rarely clear-cut, and the hammer's discovery only deepened the sense that this case was far from over. Back at the station, Sheriff Willis stared at the map of Willow Creek pinned to the wall. The red lines marked the places connected to the murder: Mary's house, the truck seen by the woods, and now the spot where the hammer had been found. But the lines didn't form a picture, they only led to more questions. And somewhere out there, in the quiet streets of Willow Creek, the killer was still watching. The discovery of the hammer sent ripples through Willow Creek, rekindling fear in the hearts of its residents. Whispers grew louder, and trust continued to erode. Every neighbor became a suspect. Every passing glance was filled with suspicion. The town's once idyllic streets now felt suffocating, as though the killer's presence lurked in every shadow. Sheriff Willis found himself haunted by the growing pressure to solve the case. He knew the hammer might provide some answers, but the results from the forensic lab came back inconclusive. No usable fingerprints, no blood evidence that could definitively link it to Mary's murder. The hammer was worn down, corroded by the creek's waters. It had been there for some time, perhaps before the murder, perhaps long after. It was yet another dead end, but something about its discovery still gnawed at him. Determined not to let the town spiral into further panic, the sheriff turned his attention back to the small, curious detail of Mary's cash withdrawals. He revisited the local bank where Mary had kept her accounts, hoping for a lead. It was a small bank, one where the tellers knew every customer by name, and Mary had always been considered one of their most reliable patrons. But what Willis found in her bank records made his stomach tighten. For the last several months, Mary had withdrawn large sums in cash just days before driving to a nearby town, Riverside. The pattern was almost too neat, happening like clockwork on the third weekend of each month. But what was she doing there? Riverside was larger than Willow Creek, but still small enough that its inhabitants might remember an unfamiliar face. Armed with this new lead, Sheriff Willis made the 30-minute drive to Riverside and began asking questions. They stopped at gas stations, diners, and local shops. Most people shrugged off his questions, not recalling anyone fitting Mary's description. But then one person did. At the edge of town, an old motel owner remembered her. Mary had stayed there a few times, always quiet, always paying in cash. The man couldn't recall much else, but his brief recollection raised even more questions for the sheriff. Why would Mary need a motel just a short drive from Willow Creek? What was she doing on these trips? Sheriff Willis left Riverside feeling as though he were chasing ghosts. But a theory was beginning to form in his mind, a disturbing one that he hadn't yet voiced. Mary's murder might not have been a random act of violence. Perhaps it was connected to something much darker, a secret she had been keeping for years. The investigation took another grim turn when the sheriff's office received an anonymous tip. Late in the evening, the voice on the other end, muffled and shaky, said that Mary had been involved in something she shouldn't have been, and then abruptly hung up. Though vague, the call sent shivers down Willis's spine. It was the first time anyone had suggested Mary wasn't entirely innocent. The sheriff began to think back to the months before Mary's death. Had there been any signs? Anything at all that pointed to a hidden life? People often assume those around them live quiet, predictable lives, but the reality was that even the most ordinary person could be hiding something. Sheriff Willis intensified his questioning around town, focusing on anyone who might have noticed Mary acting strangely in the weeks before her death. At first, most people were reluctant to speak ill of the dead, especially Mary, who had been so well liked. But as the sheriff pressed, cracks began to show in the town's polite facade. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Lowell, finally admitted that Mary had become reclusive in the months leading up to the murder. She had stopped attending community events, rarely talked to her neighbors, and was seen pacing in her backyard at odd hours of the night. More troubling were the frequent visits from a man Mrs. Lowell didn't recognize, though she never got a good look at his face. He always arrived late, usually under the cover of darkness, and left quickly. The sheriff's mind raced. Could this stranger be the same man seen near Mary's house before her murder? The idea that Mary had been meeting someone in secret only deepened the mystery. If she had been hiding a relationship, why the secrecy? Why the sudden change in her behavior? Sheriff Willis dug deeper into Mary's financial records, hoping to find another clue. It didn't take long to discover something startling. There were several wire transfers made to an unfamiliar name, a man from out of state, Darren Keating. The name had never come up before in the investigation, and Willis knew instantly this was significant. Was this Darren the man Mary had been secretly meeting? The amounts transferred were sizable, far larger than the cash withdrawals she had been making, and the transfers had been happening for nearly a year. Whatever their connection was, it wasn't casual. Could it be blackmail after all, or had Mary gotten herself involved in something more dangerous? The sheriff had the name run through national databases, hoping to find any information on Darren Keating. What came back was worse than he imagined. Darren had a criminal record, including charges of fraud and extortion. He was no stranger to coercing people for money. Willow Creek's secretive, quiet schoolteacher wasn't who everyone thought she was, and the more the sheriff uncovered, the more it became clear that Mary's murder was far from a random act of violence. There were layers of deception to her life, and someone had decided she knew too much. The walls of Willow Creek seemed to close in as the sheriff realized the killer might be closer than he ever imagined. Sheriff Willis's discovery of Darren Keating's involvement with Mary changed the direction of the investigation entirely. From what was once thought to be a senseless act of violence was now taking shape as something far more calculated and sinister. But one question lingered above all: what had Mary been mixed up in that led to her brutal death? The sheriff contacted authorities in Darren Keating's home state, but Darren had seemingly vanished. No recent addresses, no active phone numbers. It was as if he had disappeared after Mary's murder. Timing was too coincidental, too perfect. Whoever Darren was, he knew how to cover his tracks, and Sheriff Willis feared that Mary had been his latest victim in a long line of unsuspecting marks. But then came another break. A deputy from Riverside remembered something unusual. A truck matching the description of the one seen near Mary's house had been parked outside a storage unit on the outskirts of town. It was there for a few days after the murder, but then it disappeared. Sheriff Willis wasted no time. He drove to the storage facility, hoping that Darren had left behind something that could link him to the crime. The manager was cooperative, and after a quick check, confirmed that Darren Keating had indeed rented a unit under a false name. The sheriff, heart pounding, unlocked the unit, half expecting it to be empty or filled with the discarded belongings of another scam. But inside, he found a gold mine of evidence. The small windowless unit was crammed with documents, false IDs, and laptops. But what caught Willis's attention was a stack of photos of Mary. They were taken from a distance, some while she was at home, others while she was walking near the creek. The photos were dated, going back over a year. Darren had been watching her, possibly even before their financial arrangement began. As Willis sifted through the paperwork, he uncovered a disturbing truth. Darren wasn't just extorting Mary, he was running a long con. Hidden in the documents were fraudulent contracts and fake business dealings, all tied to a shell company in which Mary's name had been forged. She had unknowingly been entangled in a scheme to launder money through fake real estate deals, and once she realized the extent of the scam, she had likely tried to pull away, a mistake that may have cost her life. One document stood out from the rest, an email draft never sent that Mary had written but hadn't finished. It was addressed to an attorney, detailing how she had been manipulated into signing contracts and how she feared for her safety. The sheriff's blood ran cold as he realized that Mary had been preparing to expose Darren. She must have confronted him, and in doing so, sealed her fate. Darren's motive for murder was clear. He had too much at stake to let Mary ruin his operation. But finding Darren was another matter entirely. He had disappeared, leaving behind only these fragments of his life, a predator who had escaped into the shadows, leaving destruction in his wake. As Sheriff Willis pieced together the chain of events, the weight of the town's fears grew heavier. Darren was no ordinary criminal. He was a master manipulator who knew how to disappear when things got too hot. But the sheriff wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't let Darren get away with murder, and there was still one clue left to follow: the truck. The truck, now the key to tracking Darren, had last been spotted in a neighboring state. The sheriff alerted state troopers and the FBI, but the search was slow. Darren had likely abandoned the vehicle, vanishing into a new vehicle, a new identity, as he had done so many times before. But Willis had one more card to play: the storage unit. He had carefully documented everything found in the unit, hoping that the trail of fake names and financial records might eventually lead him to Darren. As he studied the forged documents, a name popped up again and again, not one of Darren's aliases, but that of a small real estate firm in Chicago. It was thin, but it was the best lead they had. Darren had used this firm to funnel money, and if he was tied to it, it could be the key to finding him. Though working with the FBI, Willis followed the paper trail. It led to a low-end apartment in Chicago's industrial district, a place rented under another one of Darren's pseudonyms. The team moved fast, not willing to let him slip through their fingers again. They staked out the building, waiting for any sign of Darren. Days passed, and the stakeout seemed futile. But then, on a rainy afternoon, a man matching Darren's description walked out of the apartment building. He looked different, thinner, with dyed hair and glasses, but Willis knew it was him. They followed him, careful not to alert him, as he made his way to a train station. Darren was on the move again, trying to disappear once more. But this time, he wouldn't get away. The team cornered him at the station, and when Darren realized he had been caught, his calm faltered. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was arrested without incident, his attempt to escape cut short. Back in Willow Creek, the town slowly began to heal. Darren's arrest brought a sense of closure, though the scars of Mary's death would never truly fade. Her secret life, once hidden beneath layers of deception, had been brought into the light, and with it, the darkness that had plagued the town. For Sheriff Willis, the case had been more than just another investigation. It had been a reminder of how fragile the line between peace and chaos truly was. As he drove the quiet streets of Willow Creek one last time, he couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets the town still held, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover them. Darren Keating's arrest brought a wave of relief to Willow Creek, but the town's wounds ran deep. The arrest had brought the killer to justice, yet the aftermath of Mary Holden's murder lingered like a dark cloud. As Darren faced charges for both murder and fraud, the media descended on Willow Creek, turning the quiet town into a backdrop for sensational headlines. Residents who had once taken pride in their peaceful lives now found themselves in the spotlight, their town forever linked to a gruesome crime. Sheriff Willis remained focused on tying up loose ends. Darren had confessed to the murder, but his confession had been cold, devoid of remorse. He admitted that Mary had become a liability when she discovered the depth of his scheme. She had demanded to cut ties, even threatening to expose him, but Darren's long con relied on silence, on control. When he realized she would not be silenced, he made a plan to ensure she never spoke again. It was a calculated act. Darren had watched Mary, studied her routines, and waited for the right moment. The night of her murder, he had entered her house with a copy of her key, taken during one of their meetings. He had confronted her, a final attempt to make her comply, but when she resisted, he snapped. The hammer, later found near the creek, had been his weapon of choice, left behind in a panic after the killing. Sheriff Willis listened to Darren's confession with a sense of disgust. This wasn't a crime of passion, but of cold-blooded pragmatism. Mary had been a pawn in a game of deception. Her life ended because she had dared to challenge a man who thrived in the shadows. Darren had fled after the murder, knowing the small-town police force would take time to catch up, but his arrogance had been his downfall. The paper trail he left behind led directly to his capture. Despite the closure the arrest brought, Willow Creek was left in mourning. Mary's funeral was a somber affair, attended by friends, colleagues, and townspeople who had once known her as the quiet, kind schoolteacher. In death, her secrets were laid bare, but the tragedy had also reminded everyone of her humanity, her struggles, her fears, and the life she had tried to protect. For Sheriff Willis, the case had been a personal one. Mary's murder had unraveled the facade of small-town peace and exposed the dark undercurrents of human nature. As he stood by her gravesite, watching the last shovels of dirt cover the coffin, he felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. Justice had been served, but there was no undoing the damage that had been done. As months passed, Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, though it would never be quite the same. The scars left by Mary's murder and Darren's manipulation remained, a reminder of how even the most peaceful places can harbor dark secrets. To the residents who had once trusted each other implicitly now carried a hint of doubt in their hearts, a reminder that anyone could be hiding something beneath the surface. The town rebuilt itself in subtle ways. The community, once fractured by fear, began to pull together. Memorials for Mary were held at the local school, where her colleagues and former students spoke of her warmth and dedication. The townspeople, shaken by the realization that they had known so little about her struggles, sought to reconnect with each other, to close the gaps in their small world that had allowed such a tragedy to occur unnoticed. Sheriff Willis continued his work, but the case had changed him. The violence, the lies, the way it had all unraveled in front of him, it had reminded him that no town, no matter how peaceful, is immune to darkness. He took comfort in the fact that justice had been served, but the fragility of life, the thin line between normalcy and chaos, lingered in his mind. He had faced evil in its rawest form, and though he had caught the man responsible, the experience left an indelible mark on him. Willis found solace in the small things. The way the sun set over the hills, the laughter of children playing in the town square, the sound of the creek flowing peacefully once more. These simple moments reminded him of why he had chosen to stay in Willow Creek all these years. There would always be darkness in the world, but as long as there were people to stand against it, there was still hope. Darren Keating's trial was a swift affair, with an overwhelming amount of evidence against him. He was convicted of both murder and fraud, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His name became synonymous with the darkest chapter in Willow Creek's history, a symbol of the evil that had briefly disrupted their lives. But for most, Darren's name would fade over time, a shadow cast by the greater memory of Mary and the town's resilience in the face of tragedy. In the end, Willow Creek endured. The town moved forward, forever changed, but not broken. The people of Willow Creek, once shaken to their core, began to rebuild their sense of community. Trust, though fragile, was slowly restored, and the town reclaimed its identity, not as a place defined by a murder, but by its ability to heal. Sheriff Willis watched from his office window, looking out over the town he had served for decades. The trees rustled in the cool autumn breeze, and the creek flowed quietly in the distance. Life went on in Willow Creek, and though darkness had passed through its streets, it had not stayed. The town had survived, and so had he.